Hello, my name's Emma, and I'm super excited to be making this training video for BP Nationals. Congratulations on making it to this tournament. It's a very exciting, very prestigious tournament. I'm sure it's going to be an excellent weekend. I'm very excited to hopefully get a chance to meet lots of you this weekend. If you see me in the hallways of Western Canada, feel free to flag me down. I love nothing more than talking about debate, so if you have any questions from this video, or you just want to yap about debate, that's my favorite thing to do. I'm also actually a very proud Western Canada High School alumni. Back in the day, that's where my debate career started. And I've been debating for a long time since then. I went on to do my undergrad at the University of Alberta in political science. And I debated a ton through my undergrad at all kinds of tournaments across Canada, across the world. I've been to the World Championships a few times, once in Bangkok, once in Mexico City. I was a finalist at Hart House 2 years in a row, and last year I was the third speaker at that tournament. I've also won the UBC IV and broken it a whole bunch of different tournaments, Cambridge IV, the North American University Debate Championships, the Hugel Western Canadian Championships, and I got to go to the HWS round robin, which was very exciting. So there are some embarrassing videos of me debating on the internet, some of which I'm not super proud of, but some of which I am really proud of. So that's a wonderful thing. Now I live in Montreal. I am doing my education degree at McGill, and so I'm very excited to be talking about a very education-y motion with all of y'all. But before I jump into this motion and talking a little bit about some approaches, I just wanted to chat really quickly about what debate means to me and why I've stuck around and continued judging and coaching and being involved in the community for so long. So not only I think has debate built a ton of really foundational skills for me, I think especially the idea of just like being able to organize information. I know we talk about in debate, like obviously persuasion, public speaking, stuff like that. But I think also in particular, I found, especially in my favorite position as closing opposition whip, the valuable skill of kind of parsing through lots of different pieces of information and establishing what's most important and organizing things a lot more clearly when sometimes the ideas were maybe unclear, kind of going through the idea soup and pulling out what matters and really crystallizing ideas. That's a skill that I use like every single day in my life. So debate has been totally foundational for me. It's also, I would say, where I've met like most of my best friends in this entire world. I'm literally getting married to the person that I debated with in my undergrad and went to Worlds with a few times. So that's a real testament, I think, to the power of debate. And I really hope that you stick around and do this activity for a long time because it's a really excellent, wonderful thing to be a part of. Okay, let's talk about this motion. So the motion we're going to chat about today is this house supports the competitive gamification of classrooms. So I often find there's kind of in quite a few motions, not every single motion, but lots of motions, there are sort of three fundamental questions we want to be asking and kind of three burdens that government has / three areas where opposition is going to try and disprove the government case. So what are those three areas? The first thing is identifying some kind of problem with the status quo as to why we're having this debate in the first place. What kinds of things could be existing in the world as it is now that we might want to be try addressing with this kind of motion? So in this situation on government, the first thing you're probably going to want to do is characterize some kind of problem with the education system right now that would require an addition of something like gamification in order to fix it. So there's kind of a few ways you could approach this. I think some of the more strategic ones would be talking about things like student disengagement and apathy, the fact that a lot of students maybe don't feel super motivated to engage with schoolwork, especially outside of kind of times that they're being tested. Maybe the day-to-day feels a lot more banal to them, a lot less engaged, a lot less motivated. You could talk about things like short attention spans. I know all of us probably have experienced the TikTokification of our brains, and it feels hard to pay attention to anything longer than like 30 seconds. If you're still here with me paying attention 4 minutes in, congrats. I'm very proud of you. But yeah, I think there's a lot of potential approaches that we could take about kind of things that might be wrong with the education system that we might want to be fixing with this motion. So the second thing then you're going to want to do on government is talk about how this motion actually fixes that problem, right? Because it might be true that there are problems in the status quo, but why is this motion the solution going to be the solution to those problems? So let's say, for example, that we decided to focus on motivation and student motivation. So we've characterized the problem. We've said that students are not motivated. They're not connecting with school as much as we want them to. how can this fix that problem? So I think it's important that you explain things like kind of what about a gamification or leaderboard system actually motivates people. So this is where sometimes you have to get into things that might feel a little bit obvious to you when you're generating arguments, that you really want to make sure to like try and explain kind of the pieces of the logic to ensure that judges can really credit you for each part of this argument. So it may feel a little bit obvious to talk about things like, you know, the fact that just like people are really motivated by like actual numbers and things that are quantifiable, by points, by competition. It's also just like fun and exciting to see, like, you know, to feel like you're in a game or you're in like a battle or you're engaged in this kind of way. And so all that kind of explanation of how a leaderboard or a point system can get people motivated, and there's obviously layers you can add to that, is going to be really important if you're trying to prove why this fixes the problem of student motivation. Okay, you also probably want to anticipate some of the things that opposition might say, especially when you're talking about something like motivation, because I think when we're thinking about this argument, I think it's probably not a huge stretch to imagine that opposition is going to talk about the difference between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, right? I'm sure opposition will come up and talk about how motivation that's like just based on acquiring points is not nearly as healthy and sustainable as motivation that comes from like a deep desire within your heart to do well at school. So I think if we want to make our motivation argument as strong as it possibly can, we want to try and anticipate this a little bit and insulate our argument from this. That means that even if the opposition doesn't actually bring up this argument, our argument's been made stronger by anticipating possible problems with it and then ensuring that those problems have already been addressed within the argument itself. So I think this is where we can explain not only just how motivation works in terms of people seeing points and a leaderboard, but how motivation matters in a school setting. So it's probably the case that you don't have to be like, even in a normal world, even in the best case scenario, you're probably not going to be motivated by every single thing in school, right? I don't think even the very best student comes to school every single day with their absolute best self, 100% locked in, like ready to go all the time. We all often need a little jump start to our motivation to kind of top up whatever our like normal baseline is, right? And so having this additional kind of like jump and burst is probably useful, even if you're someone who already has some amount of healthy motivation yourself. If you're someone who maybe doesn't have really that much motivation at all, this is also potentially a way to almost like build muscle memory. Like once you practice getting invested in something and you're maybe just excited about it because of the points, but then you realize because you're actually like keeping up with the schoolwork and staying engaged and paying attention every day, you can often find other kind of entry points into motivation, things that can motivate you. And so even if this was just the starting point, motivation can kind of build itself afterwards. So I think we can explain that this doesn't have to be the end-all be-all of motivation, but it creates for students this really important spark that makes sure that they're getting engaged in school, they're feeling happy to be there and ready to learn, which means then they get a lot more of the benefits of the outcomes. We can also just talk about how maybe the outcomes are more important than the motivation itself. Maybe even if students don't build this like beautiful intrinsic self-discipline, they just like learn more calculus or learn more history. And I'm sure you can make an argument for why those things really matter in and of themselves. And so these are kind of different approaches you can take to start to build your arguments about motivation. See how we started with this like fairly straightforward concept of just like motivation matters and it's a problem we're trying to fix. And there's lots of different ways to branch out this argument to make it as strong as you possibly can and show what some of those impacts could be in terms of benefits that we're getting. Okay, so the first two questions we've kind of tried to answer. First of all, what's the problem in the status quo? Second of all, how does this problem fix, or how does this motion fix that problem? And then third, are there any other kind of like general benefits or harms we need to weigh out so that we can determine whether the world is like overall better on one side or the other? So you might also want to add some additional benefits here that maybe aren't related to your first problem that you identified in the status quo, but are also really important. I think an example of this on Gov in this motion is just the idea that like, you know, it's funny, as an education student, I'm learning this a lot. A lot of the ways that we do education, maybe not the best. I know we've probably all had a teacher who does a lot of rambling, does a lot of lecturing. There's just a lot of evidence to suggest that that's not a great strategy for students and doesn't really engage them very much. And so maybe having this really student-driven model where students have to be doing activities, they have to be way more active in order to be like earning points and moving up the leaderboard. I'm probably going to force teachers to reconsider a lot of how they structure their classroom, what kinds of activities they do in an average class, like during an average class period. And you're probably going to encourage a real rethinking of education that maybe can lead to a bunch of additional benefits like more student participation, more active learning, just like things that are like very pedagogically proven to be better than just retaining information and like rote memorization and a lot of the kind of standard traditional educational practices that we have. So that's kind of a way you can also add not only does this fix a core problem, but it creates these additional benefits that we think are probably good. Another way you could structure that argument is that maybe the core problem is these like old ways that education has been structured, and that's how we fix it. It's definitely not like a, you don't have to follow this model, but I find it's often a way to start thinking about why this motion exists and what the possible benefits could be. What are the problems that probably this is trying to fix? How does this solve the problem? And then are there other additional benefits that we need to consider? So that's kind of the gov perspective. Let's talk about opposition a little bit. So this is also a good way to sometimes think about the opposition side of the case, which is basically just flipping those questions. So trying to poke holes in one of those three sets of assumptions or answers. So the first thing you can try to approach this with is just maybe there isn't a problem. Maybe the status quo is totally fine. This can also look like saying maybe there is a problem, but there's already other solutions being implemented in the status quo, or sometimes you can propose a different solution that you're coming up with, but obviously be careful with this. I think the whole like counterprop thing is a tale for another time. But basically, yeah, the first layer, is this a real problem? And is this the way that we can address this? So in this motion, I think it's probably going to be a little bit challenging to say that there are no problems with education in the status quo. It's just such a big thing. It's ever evolving. Our world is changing all the time. I think there's probably some amount of problem that government can argue for that exists in education. But I think there are lots of ways that you can decide based on what government presents as the problem to talk about ways that those are being addressed already. So for example, it is the case that a lot of teachers and education administrators and systems recognize that all this research about how like direct memorization and lecturing isn't really effective, that's like not news, right? People are aware of that as a fact. And so a lot of schools are really changing the way that they structure learning already. They're already moving towards a lot more active participation. We don't maybe need this specific change of gamification to make those changes happen. If government wants to talk about things like short attention spans, you could talk about how in places like Quebec, they're having actually just like a full ban on phones in schools and trying to do kind of a hard reset on people's attention spans. So there are probably other approaches you can take to the issue, the core problem that government has identified, and thinking about those can help kind of take the air out of government's tires a little bit when they're going to try and prove that this is the solution that has to happen to this problem. Okay, second thing is you can prove quite specifically that this doesn't fix the problem that government has identified based on the terms that they've identified it. So this can be pretty powerful if you can do this one effectively. So let's say government wants to fight on the battle of motivation. This is where I think we can build the argument that government may have anticipated us building, and we can probably still beat them. Even if they've insulated their argument quite a bit, we can probably still find a way to beat them in opposition. So I think this extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation is a really important clash in this debate. And I think you can build a really good case for the fact that if you have to rely on something else being the reason why you're investing in something, if you have to rely on points, on moving up the leaderboard, on like a tangible thing that you can see that measures your progress, that's probably not going to be beneficial for you. There's a ton of research that suggests that, and this is also I think just like a relatively intuitive thing, that humans when they see like a number, fixate on the number and then ignore any like qualitative information attached to it. So students often when they get their report cards or like a test back, and I'm sure you've experienced this as a student, if it has like a number grade at the top, students will often take in that information and then literally not even read the comments that your poor teacher probably spent a super long time writing and thinking about. Our human brains are like wired to take in quantitative data, and we have a really hard time kind of parsing quantitative data alongside qualitative data. This is also like, I don't know if you use a service like Goodreads or even like Uber, like things that have star rating systems. People often look at the star rating and they don't look at like, the reviews. Like even if they do look at the reviews, the star rating is the thing that's like really holding in their brain, right? So I think you can argue that often people get really fixated on numbers, and there is no equivalent to this system in the real world, right? Students are going to leave school, they're going to be adults, and unfortunately there's no leaderboard for being an adult. I get no points when I wash my dishes and do the things I pay my taxes, etc. And so I think there's a really solid argument to be made that even if government wants to present it as like a jump start and like these healthy habits are going to build afterwards, that it's impossible for those healthy habits to happen when you build this kind of dependency on this kind of structure and system of instant gratification, of quantified numbers that show your progress, that kind of thing. And so you literally like eliminate the possibility for people to build their own self-sustaining habits. So I think you can totally win the to clash on the importance of extrinsic motivation and how this actively undermines the building of intrinsic motivation, the one that comes within yourself, the inside. So you can also then, I think, explain why that is the most important thing, why actually being able to just like develop discipline and do things that you don't want to do is going to be your most important outcome in life, and honestly the most important thing that we get out of school a lot of the time. I will confess, there are a lot of things I learned in high school that I do not remember. This doesn't mean they weren't important or that I regret learning them, and you should definitely still study and pay attention in school. But a lot of things that have stuck with me now this far out from high school is a lot of the strategies, a lot of the things that I do when I don't want to do something, how I make sure I can study effectively, all those kinds of things that I had to develop because I had to build those skills myself, and there wasn't like a force pulling me towards those things. Sure, we have grades, but a lot of the day-to-day motivation had to come from within myself, and I think that's a really important skill that has carried me on as an adult way more than any like detail of anything that I learned in math class. Sorry to my math teachers. Okay, first strategy on op, there isn't a problem, or this problem is already in the process of being solved. Strategy number 2, the solution proposed by the motion does not fix the problem, or maybe even makes the problem worse. Strategy number 3, there are just other harms that are created that make the world worse, even if we fix the problem that government has identified. So, it's possible that government has done an amazing job proving that this is going to fix motivation, or it's going to engage students, or it's going to fix their attention spans or something. They've built like this beautiful case, they've set up a problem, they're like, this is going to be fantastic. But maybe they haven't proven that that's the most important thing in the round. And if you can prove another kind of harm, you can then tell us why that harm accruing is way worse and like makes the world worse, even if the world gets better in this way the government has proven to us. This is why weighing is so important, if that's a word that you've heard before. So I think an example of how you could do this in this motion on opposition is talking about just like the way that social interactions will be changed by having like a literal list of like who is the best at school that you can all look at and has numbers on it. I think that's probably quite intuitive as to why that would be very negative potentially in terms of creating really unhealthy competition, weird social dynamics between people who are higher up on the leaderboard and lower on the leaderboard, really weird things about self-concept and self-esteem. Students succeed a lot more when they feel they have kind of like a growth mindset. They feel like they can improve. They identify as being like a learner or a smart person, versus these like fixed identities as someone who's not good at school or who doesn't like school. And so the more we like solidify kind of these like rankings of people thinking of themselves these way or thinking of other people these ways, the more I think we create A, those really unhealthy self-conceptions, and B, those really unhealthy social dynamics. And so if there's a world where government has proven you get way better study habits, you get way better connection with the learning and engaging with the material, cool. But what does that mean if you have a bunch of students who aren't engaging with material at all because they now feel like they're dumb and bad at school and totally disconnect because their self-esteem and their social ability to engage socially has been totally destroyed by this competitive mechanism? That's probably going to undermine a lot of the benefit that government is getting on their side of the world. Okay, I hope that kind of makes sense. Obviously, this is not an extensive rundown of every possible argument you could argue on either side of the house, but I hope it's kind of a conceptual, like seeing how you can start to look at arguments sometimes and come up with kind of ways to engage with emotion. I just want to note also how this kind of looks on back half. So I think when I was taught how to do extensions, I basically, and maybe some of you have learned it this way too, was told to just like come up with like just a list, like a big list of like as many arguments as I could come up with and just like write them all down and then listen to the front half and just like cross out the arguments as the front half stole them and then just take whatever was left and like do my best. It's not an approach, but this is not the extension approach I'd recommend. And this is why I think I want to encourage you to think kind of holistically about the round and what needs to be proven in those more general ways. That's also, I think, the key to winning on back half. So often you can find the best extension in thinking about which of these 3 pieces of the debate. Is there a problem? Does this motion fix the problem? And then what are the aggregate harms or benefits at the end? Which of those 3 things does your top half do the least well? So often, I've definitely lost debates where I did an excellent job as top half characterizing the problem. I had a very embarrassing hard house round where I was talking about the Darien Gap, and I just like talked a lot about like the jungle animals and the dangers of the Darien Gap, and I did not prove at all why the motion itself would fix any of those problems. And so my back half was very easily able to win over me because they filled in that gap that I didn't realize that I had left, which, my bad. So often thinking about kind of that structure of what needs to be proven can help you see where strategically your front half is weakest and not just like what material they haven't covered. So rather than thinking about arguments kind of in a quantitative way, try and think about kind of what's actually key to winning this debate. What have they not proven that they need to, in that kind of sense. So it's a little bit scary because sometimes it involves going into the debate without necessarily an argument super developed before. But you can spend a lot of your prep time and back half thinking through those 3 questions and thinking about where the gaps might kind of emerge and what you can say, like the best kind of answers you can give to each of those questions so that you can decide which one to run with, if that makes sense. That doesn't always work. Sometimes your front half is great and they answer all 3 of those questions pretty well. You can always provide different answers to to those questions. So maybe they choose a problem to identify that's actually really not that big of a deal, and you have a better problem. Maybe you can better prove that the motion fixes the problem. There's always space in those kinds of ways. And if all else fails, I encourage you to often think about what kind of actors or people might be impacted by this that the front half might forget about if you're really desperate. A hint here is that in education motions, people almost always forget about, like they remember to talk about teachers and students, and they sometimes forget to talk about parents, administrators, like how kind of school is going to be organized or administrated, or like the public, like what's going to happen when this generation of kids who've been educated in this way graduate and become like just the population at large. So there's often ways that you can kind of build out arguments from just thinking about what like category of people haven't been considered here, and sometimes that's a good way to find an extension too. Okay, I hope this was helpful. I am super pumped for all of you and I hope you have an excellent tournament this weekend. And I look forward to hopefully meeting lots of you and cheering you on. And yeah, best of luck. Cheers.